Good evening. I want to welcome everyone to the Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, September 2nd. And we are in the process of a kind of countdown to the weekend of September 10th, 11th, and 12th, the 20th anniversary of the attack of September 11th, and, of course, the subsequent policies that were identified with Patriot Act and other policies that followed. One of the elements that is little recalled when this idea of the 20th anniversary is brought up is the financial conditions of the transatlantic system just prior to September 11th. I want to note that merely because it's important to recognize that it's obvious that what occurred that day came out of processes that preceded it, processes that we have argued since that time were never the processes as discussed, that it was not some generalized anti-Western Islamic terrorism that was unleashed that day, but that a process far different than that occurred. Let me also just note that, of course, this time last week, there was still a significant question as to whether or not there would be a successful conclusion of the removal of the United States from Afghanistan, militarily removal. That has occurred. And in response to that, there has been all sorts of freak-out responses, whether we're talking about the British press per se or the Heritage Foundation here in the United States. There are continuous laments of the end of an era, that era supposedly being the era of American triumphalism, or at least the notion of the forward extension of American military might as the primary tool of diplomacy in the world. If you want to call it diplomacy. That is now declared to be over, which is kind of interesting since obviously it would be questionable that a single event like that, especially given all the controversy with how it was being done, could have in fact been responsible for that kind of a change. But nonetheless, this keeps being written about and talked about and discussed, and that the special relationship, as it's called, between the United States and Britain, which is really a treasonous relationship, has been severely damaged, perhaps not beyond repair, but certainly it has been, at least at the moment, decisively changed. But in fact, we have to do something a bit different. Our organization, of course, has been releasing various documents and white papers and books and pamphlets in its history, which have often stated things that have astounded others and have always opposed the general so-called narrative that is placed before people. We're about to do the same thing, both in the Executive Intelligence Review magazine and in terms of pamphlets that are going to come out. I think Paul Gallagher will be able to discuss that, and we'll discuss that in some of what he says. We're going to go right to Paul, but we're going to try tonight to also bring in the dimension that is generally left out, generally not considered, and is generally the most important, which is what is the relationship between the continually decomposing transatlantic financial structure and these other processes that are presently ongoing. And is there a way to stop the politics of tragedy from seizing the initiative in the globe and causing the politics that Lyndon LaRouche represented of true physical economy, for that to actually prevail? So we want to make sure we're sort of vectoring our conversation in that direction tonight, inclusive of why and how we're proposing policies around Afghanistan, around world health care, around nuclear power and technology, why it is that all of these are susceptible of being both not only understood, but actually being implemented right now, even though the moment seems to state otherwise. And so I want to go right to Paul, and then once Paul gets a chance to say what he has to say, we'll open up the lines for questions and discussion, and then conclude. So, Paul?
Well, I want to start by something you mentioned, that what EIR is getting ready to do. We're going to, people have probably noticed, there has been at the top of the LaRouche Pub or EIR website for some time now, most of August, a white paper, an off-print, which can be off-printed, on Afghanistan, which came out of the first of a series of conferences that dealt with this subject, the coming change, the coming withdrawal at that time when we started to deal with it, and with the opinions of experts, including experts from European governments, from the Russian government, from the Chinese think tanks, and from Central Asian countries in the region of Afghanistan, their views on what opportunity was going to open up and what could be done about it, and how this could actually cause a considerable change in the favorable prospects of economic recovery in the United States, for that matter. So we've had that in print, and the steps that had to be taken once that withdrawal was done. We've had that in print now, and we're modifying it and updating it, and most importantly, in the forthcoming EIR, with what is really the seminal document of this entire period, that is this 20-year period, that is the record of the interview that Lyndon LaRouche was in the midst of on the morning of September 11th, 2001, with Jack Stockwell on a Utah radio station with a large audience, and learned, both Stockwell and LaRouche simultaneously learned in stages of what was unfolding in the attack, first on the World Trade Towers, and then on the Pentagon, and then later the first indications of the fourth plane and what had happened to it. But the instant that LaRouche was informed that the events beginning with the planes striking the World Trade Centers were occurring, he said, "Don't let anybody tell you that this is Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden is not an independent force." And went on to insist that on the spot, with no further means of analysis offered to him and no further news, on the spot went on to insist that there had to be actions that had been taken to penetrate the security screen of the United States military protection of the country and against this kind of attack, and that involved in penetrating that security screen had to be probably foreign powers and also elements of the U.S. intelligence community itself. He then was interviewed repeatedly for a certain period of days after that, until, in particular, BBC ordered that this should stop, because what LaRouche was unfolding in those interviews was what the United States really had to do in order to unearth what had happened, why it had happened, who had done it, and in order to cure what had been a devastating injury, wound to the country, not just to the places that were hit in the country, not just to the people who died, but the wound that was done to the entire population had to be cured, dealt with at least, by this kind of search for knowledge and then action on the basis of real knowledge. That interview in every detail is going to be republished in the EIR next week, and that document really is the fundamental story of what has gone wrong in the last 20 years, which has comprised, among other things, the United States' eventually clearly disastrous war in Afghanistan and wars in other places. I want to primarily to just follow through on Helga LaRouche's webcast this afternoon, which is posted on the Schiller Institute website. Everyone should watch it, half-hour webcast on this subject primarily, and on the British reaction to it. And it's the foreshadowing of a piece that she is writing, which is also going to go into the EIR and into the expanded off-print for organizing with around the country and implicitly around the world. If we go back to August 16th, that was a Monday morning when the Taliban had taken over Kabul the previous afternoon. The report that we had on military developments was full of details of a failure, of a debacle that was being bemoaned in all the media in the United States and Europe already. And in discussions that morning with Helga and then with the NEC at its morning meeting, my responsibility was simply to present a brief summary of that morning's intelligence. My instinct was to recommend that zero attention be paid to any media reports and that no details of any of the military reports which were already had developed that morning be gone over, but rather to present a simple assessment that this withdrawal, this retreat, which it had then become as of the 15th and 16th, this represented a great opportunity for a victory of Helga's policy for the Belt and Road coming into Afghanistan and through it, which had just been presented to the world's and to Central Asia's major governments and institutions around the July 31st Schiller Institute conference on Afghanistan. There she had already said that it is the endless war policy that is all that's failing. And that this was also out already through the EIR, through the LaRouche organization and Schiller Institute's organizing processes. So the Belt and Road now might be extended through Afghanistan, and that country could see physical economic development. And that this was a great potential opportunity for the United States, which could provide credit not forthcoming anywhere else, and engineering capabilities, which would help those of other major nations, for healthcare and infrastructure development in that region, especially in that country which is so poor, in such a wrecked economic condition, that it is to that region the way the southeast of the United States was to the United States as a whole before FDR launched the Tennessee Valley Authority and transformed it. And so we had the situation, the Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires, yes, but at this moment it is also welcoming the aid of republics. So the question is, which are we? And to a surprising degree, that question comes home to Americans at this point. So this was true. This opportunity was true, even though the developments were, in fact, a military failure and a debacle, and every neocon and every neoliberal and every British peer frantically wants to limit your understanding of this withdrawal from Afghanistan to a military failure and a debacle and nothing else. But in fact, this event can lead to breaking the fever of the belief in military superpowers, which has gripped the American population at least since George H.W. Bush became president for more than 30 years, enfeebling the American population as that fever has gotten worse. These events could trigger actual world citizen thinking among Americans if they are shocked into ignoring the military-industrial leadership, forgetting the financial Wall Street leadership, thinking themselves what this country can do in the world, perhaps in ways other than by projecting our suddenly not so invincible military force. So what we were really discussing that morning of the 16th was the possibility that we'd see the opening of a political mass strike in the United States, the opening of the first stage. And there's nothing romantic about this. Lyndon LaRouche discussed this with his movement for the first time more than 50 years ago in terms of the penetrating work of the young Polish Marxist economist Rosa Luxemburg, writing in 1906, and her subsequent activity as a revolutionary in Germany. Note that in the first case that was under consideration, political upheaval in Russia resulted from the Russian imperial military's first ever thorough defeat. That was by Japan in the 1905 war between them. Luxemburg later was directly involved as a leader in the political mass strike in 1917-18 Germany, which immediately followed unified Germany's first thorough defeat in World War I. But already by 1972, Lynn had organized another guiding principle in the political mass strike, that is, the power of poetic thought, or the power of thought among the citizenry, which is represented by flourishing of poetry at certain times. And as his movement grew at that time, he began insisting and inspiring that movement with Percy Shelley's idea. I'm sure most of you have heard the quote that embodies that idea by now at one time or another. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving the most intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature, unquote, from Percy Shelley. That is, a people make great poetry possible, Shelley said, by being ready to hear it and to repeat it, but only at certain times, at times which are provoked by crises. And Shelley himself, of course, started out organizing in the street at conferences in Ireland, which had also just suffered a defeat. It had lost, for the first time in 1782, after centuries of British oppression, it had won its own self-governing constitution. It had lost that again by the Act of Union of 1804 and was forced back under British rule. And a wave of agitation resulted for several years in which Shelley intervened with his pamphlets. And he wrote, and I want to quote this, "Man cannot make occasions, but he may seize those that offer. None are more interesting to philanthropy than those which excite the benevolent passions that generalize and expand private into public feelings and make the hearts of individuals vibrate, not merely for themselves, their families, and their friends, but for posterity, for a people, till their country becomes the world, and their family all the sensitive creation." So there is the possibility that that is going on. We could think also of Abraham Lincoln. This is an example that I think people will understand, but may not be well known. Obviously, one of the greatest souls of modern times, Abraham Lincoln. He burst out of years of inactivity at just such an occasion. There's one biographer who actually observed Lincoln in person in the period from the late 1840s until 1854, when Lincoln was essentially out of political life, just practicing the law. That biographer was William Herndon, his first biographer, first full biographer, and his law partner. Lincoln had been in Congress. He had had political ambition. He took a principled stand against the Mexican War. Everyone deserted him. Even those who felt as he did against slavery deserted him, except for John Quincy Adams, who shortly thereafter died. Lincoln's own Illinois constituency turned against him. The leaders of his own party denounced him. His earlier leadership of the Whigs in the state legislature at that time, in late 1840s, looked as if it had not had very good results. he spent 6 or 7 years just practicing law and raising his family. And he became, as Herndon said, one of the top lawyers in a state full of lawyers, in spite of having no formal education, little reading in the law. He was totally committed to justice for the poor and the laborer and to truth. And when he had such a cause, he was absolutely unbeatable. Lincoln is actually the model for all the lawyers that Jimmy Stewart played in the movie, except that Lincoln did not stumble onto the key to win the case and bumble into it. Lincoln was totally prepared when he had a good cause. He would guarantee his client victory in advance. He would tell his client, I'm going to skin the other side and win your claim. And he would do it. But the rest of the time, he was quiet, gradually rising in the profession, raising his family. He made speeches as a Whig functionary in Illinois in 1852, supporting General Zachary Scott for president. Herndon wrote that these speeches were unworthy of him. They stirred up nobody. Herndon was a very political person himself. And then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And Lincoln realized that every institution he believed constituted a means of progress was completely worthless. The Whig Party collapsed in pieces. The Congress was overrun by the slave power. The presidency was completely controlled by it. The Supreme Court was run by it. And realizing this, Lincoln changed completely, at least according to Herndon's testimony, and started speaking with real poetic fire, not just in speeches, but in simple law office conversations. This is really worth reading just to see some of these statements that he made in the course of conversations in his law office. And you can see this building up. And when he did then first give a speech about the Kansas-Nebraska Act at the Illinois State Fair in Springfield. It was a speech attacking Stephen Douglas, who had already spoken there. And it stunned his audience. It absolutely transformed his audience. Herndon says it startled his enemies throughout Illinois. And Herndon wrote in a newspaper, he took the heart captive and broke like a sun over the understanding of his audience. Now, so, one thinks of Lincoln often wrongly as being the epitome of wisdom and leadership at all times. He wasn't trying to exercise leadership all of the time. He reacted to a fundamental crisis in a way which transformed himself, at least in the view of all the people around him working with him who knew him best. And this is what we're speaking to and organizing, not all throughout the population, but by any means, but among the American population, because what has happened in Afghanistan may force this fever to break. It actually goes back longer than the 3 decades since old George Bush. That's the fever of relying on, of worshiping, of might makes right, and the application of superior American military force as the guaranteed way, the only way to accomplish anything. I mean, under George H.W. Bush, that really turned into imperial triumphalism. But before that, the more the nation deindustrialized, the more economically sick it got, the greater the reliance on the idea that American might must make right anywhere in the world. It was certainly there in Ronald Reagan's presidency also. Neither Reagan nor all the military figures and national security experts we were talking to had any idea of the physical economic basis of Lynn's SDI policy, even though Reagan adopted it. That worldwide laser industrial revolution, as Lynn called it. They had no idea of that. And this fever has come to the point where the only institution that's respected by the American people in the 21st century is the armed forces. It became extreme with 9/11. Not a minute was spent thinking about how or why or what powers did it. forget the victims and first responders as quickly as you can decently do so. Pick pre-selected soft targets abroad, conquer them, tell them you are with us or against us, make them be with us, and surrender your own constitutional rights and trillions of dollars for defense so that American military might can protect you from terrorism. It's just to give an idea of the shock to Americans' almost unconscious beliefs, which this withdrawal from this retreat from Afghanistan represents. It's much more visible, the shock to the British elite's beliefs, which are very conscious. But this is the way Lynn defined the potential condition for a political mass strike, a crisis which discredits in the population's eyes exactly those institutions they most relied on to keep things stable and on an even keel, so that they wouldn't let something terrible happen to us. It's not that the armed forces themselves are now discredited. Most people had some idea that the armed forces never had a mission that anyone understood in Afghanistan to do. Rather, what collapsed is this idea of this kind of pluripotency of the armed forces to do anything the country decides it wants or thinks it decides it wants, and completely unconscious of who was actually deciding what it is that we want that military to do, which that who was located in London. Completely unconscious of that. President Biden himself personally has shown this kind of axiom blowing up. First thing he said August 16th to the nation, he said, we're getting out of that country, we don't need it. Essentially, good riddance, Afghanistan. Then 2 weeks later, he said, this is the end of an era of trying to build nations with our armed forces. But there, right before our eyes, other nations are going to help rebuild Afghanistan, and they're not planning to use their armed forces to do it, but rather economic and development aid in the frame of the Belt and Road Initiative. And then by September 1st, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor on Good Morning America, we don't rule out giving direct foreign aid and assistance to a Taliban government, he said. And Lynn's idea of intervening in a political mass strike were always at a level that the people involved had not been thinking on at all, had not occurred to them, but might be provoked to think. And initially, in the early organizing documents that he wrote, those people included us, his students, his colleagues. He wrote in our first pamphlet that the movement demanding the Vietnam War should end should instead demand industrial development of underdeveloped nations, in particular Vietnam. And in our second pamphlet, he wrote what was driving anti-war students to attack American unionized workers and how they could be brought together. So now this desperate economic and social condition in Afghanistan, caused in part by our leaders' blind belief in applying superior military force, is a country which has won its independence from us and is governed by our military, quote-unquote, enemy. So again, you could say it's the graveyard of empires that try to destroy it, but now it will welcome the aid of republics to rebuild it. So which are we? As Helga said again on Tuesday, get the solutions out front to those economic development needs, and she's writing a declaration on the next steps, including the Belt and Road Initiative being led by another adversary, China. And people are becoming capable of thinking about this in a different way. So now is the time to scatter as from an unextinguished hearth ashes and sparks, LaRouche's words among mankind. This is a very unusual situation, and one which we have to be equal to with what we put out and with what we say and how we act. So that's all I wanted to say this evening.